It's been an incredible privilege to serve as the President of the Legislative Council during this milestone. And now that we're nearing the end of the year, I've had cause to reflect on the year that was and to think back on some of the highlights from our celebrations. We wanted to make this bicentenary open and inclusive, looking at all aspects of our history, but with an eye squarely on the future. To that end, I was particularly proud of our seminar series, which brought together council members past and present, along with other notable panellists, for fascinating conversations exploring the important chapters in the council's development and its representation of diverse New South Wales communities. We explored groundbreaking moments in the history of the council. We examined 40 years of LGBTQIA+ reform in New South Wales. We shared personal journeys and stories of members from cultural and linguistically diverse communities. And importantly, we held an open conversation with elders of the Wiradjuri community and esteemed historians about the first use of martial law against Aboriginal people in Bathurst. As someone who grew up in a regional town, I was delighted that we also made the decision to take the Parliament to 6 locations across the state, ensuring our regional communities also played a significant part in celebrating our bicentenary. We travelled to Lismore, then Port Macquarie, Bathurst, Batemans Bay, Armidale, and finally Wagga Wagga, to host a series of youth forums and public speaking competitions, with the winners of each region brought to Sydney to compete in the state final in the Legislative Council chamber on the very day of our 200-year anniversary. It was a genuinely profound moment for these young adults, and can I say the future is very bright should they choose to enter public life. You will hear from a couple of them tomorrow. As I'm sure many of you would have seen as you entered the Parliament today, our Legacy and Evolution exhibition charts the Council's evolution and presents an educational and highly engaging perspective about Australia's oldest legislature. As part of the launch of that exhibition, we held a luncheon to showcase the events of the past year, with guest speakers who had directly contributed to the celebrations. Of course, the highlight of the day was a visit to the New South Wales Parliament by His Majesty King Charles III, a truly special moment in our Parliament's history. His Majesty delivered a heartfelt address on the importance of representative democracy and its need to evolve to remain fit for purpose to serve in today's diverse societies. His Majesty also graciously presented the Legislative Council with a beautiful symbolic gift, an hourglass, which is now proudly displayed in our chamber and which served as the inspiration for our final conference. A particular highlight of His Majesty's visit was being able to show him our latest acquired artwork, proudly displayed in the Fountain Court. We had the pleasure of commissioning this work by Gumbanya Bunjalung artist Kim Healy, and what she's created is truly spectacular. I'd encourage you, if you haven't already, to take a moment over the next 2 days to pop upstairs and listen to the documentary about the making of that work and to take it in all its glory. And while you're at it, poke your nose into the LC chamber as well and ask one of the attendants to show you the hourglass. But that wasn't all. We held an open day with over 3,000 members of the public. We commissioned a 3-movement piece of music from the Conservatorium of Sydney. We hosted an international conference for the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association. We've had dinners and exhibitions, lectures and workshops, which brings us to the conference series, a perfect platform to reflect, celebrate and imagine. And I'm delighted to be joining you to officially launch these proceedings today. The first conference in 2022 explored the factors in the colony in 1823 that prompted the agitation for a curb on the governor's powers and autocracy. The second, last year, explored the adoption of the New South Wales Act and the establishment of the New South Wales Legislative Council and the Supreme Court. And our final conference, today and tomorrow, Through the Hourglass, will draw on a panel of some of the most expert historians, academics, legal minds and members of Parliament to provide a scholarly legacy that will be drawn on by members, officers and the parliamentary community well into the next 200 years that lies before us. Today we'll look at the entire 200 years of the Council, and tomorrow delves into the future of the Council as we explore fascinating topics like lowering the voting age, AI and democracy in the Asia Pacific. I'm particularly looking forward to moderating a panel of young leaders of tomorrow, many of whom I met through the course of the Bicentenary celebrations, to gain their perspective on the future of democracy both in New South Wales, but also more broadly around the world. But enough of me. I'd now like to introduce Mr. David Blunt, AM, the Clerk of the Parliaments, and Ms. Jenelle Moore, the Clerk Assistant and Usher of the Black Rod, as we revisit the first and second Bicentenary conferences before we commence today's exploration of the 200-year evolution of the Council in just one day. So it is my absolute pleasure to declare officially this conference open and to welcome you all. I hope that you have a very successful and enlightening conference. Thank you for being here.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. My colleague Jenelle and I will indeed shortly be providing a recap of the first two conferences, but before we do so, just some very brief housekeeping remarks. Firstly, each of the sessions over the next 2 days will be held here in the theatrette. We will endeavour to have a question and answer session of approximately 15 minutes before the end of each session, so please make sure you think of and save up your questions for that 15-minute period. If you wish to ask a question, simply raise your hand and wait for a roving microphone to arrive so you can introduce yourself and ask your question. For those online, please write your questions in the comments function on the screen, and our moderators will get them to the MCs to read out in that Q&A session. For those of you sitting in one of the two front rows, you may see a number of people with handheld cameras make their way towards the stage at different times during the day. Please don't be alarmed. They're simply capturing images and footage of the proceedings. We'll be breaking this morning at 11:15, and council staff will be on hand to escort you upstairs to the Fountain Court for morning tea. We do have the benefit of an outstanding catering service here at Parliament House, and we hope you'll really enjoy those morning and afternoon teas over the next couple of days. I understand that some of you indeed have purchased a dining package which will provide you with lunch today and tomorrow in the members' dining room. Those of you who have purchased the dining package, your passes should have a gold sticker on them. Those with special dietary requirements should also have an additional black sticker on your pass. Please make sure you make yourself known to the catering staff if that's the case. Those who haven't purchased the dining package, there is a public cafe off the Fountain Court where you might be able to get some lunch. Or, of course, there's lots of eateries around not far from Parliament, such as down at the MLC Centre. We'll return after lunch at 2:15 for what promises to be a really fantastic session with Anthony Green and former member of the Council, the Honourable Dr. Peter Phelps, before we end the afternoon with a members panel. Both promise to be real highlights of the day. In order to ensure that each session runs to time, we ask that everyone's in their seats approximately 5 minutes before the scheduled start time. Public bathroom facilities are found outside in the foyer, upstairs in the Fountain Court on the northern side. That's over on the Legislative Assembly side of the Fountain Court. If you need assistance with anything at all over the next 2 days, please speak with one of our staff from the Black Rod team who are stationed in the foyer, and water is also available in the foyer. The main exit is at the rear of the theatrette, and there's the exit to Macquarie Street there. There's also an emergency exit to my right. In the extremely unlikely event of an emergency, please follow the instructions of the parliamentary staff. And so, with those formalities completed, to the recap of the last 2 years of conferences. Can I begin with a show of hands? Who has been here with us for both conferences so far? Oh, a round of applause for all of you. And those who have been here for just one of the two previous conferences, well, again, thank you for coming back. Thank you for returning. The intention of the first conference, held over 2 days in 2022, was to explore the context, that is, the state of the colony in the 1820s that led to the establishment of the Legislative Council. The conference commenced by considering the larger cultural context of the landscape upon which the Parliament of New South Wales is now located, through a reading of country, that is, a visual verbal essay delivered by Dr. Danielle Hromek. This explored the landscape itself and the relationship and responses of Aboriginal communities to this place. Included were narratives handed down orally from deeper time, as well as more contemporary understandings from community representatives, all accompanied by stunning visual images of the landscape. So we really did try and start at the beginning of the story.
The day continued with a conversation between Dr. Paul Irish, historian, archaeology and director of Sydney firm Coast History and Heritage, and Ray Ingray, chairperson of the Gugajar Foundation, an organisation leading language, cultural and research activities within the La Perouse Aboriginal community. Ray and Paul, in conversation, discussed their research, which links together the oral histories passed down by Ray's people and written historical records to explore the lives of Sydney's coastal people. What was the story they told? Following the initial tragic impact of smallpox, which decimated the local Aboriginal population shortly after 1788, the story evolved into one of strategic relationships between the community and early governors and members of Parliament, including members of Parliament who proved to be valuable allies throughout the 19th century, ahead of the misguided and damaging policies implemented during the 20th century. Notwithstanding the ongoing legacy of those policies, the story they told was one of extraordinary ingenuity and resilience of Sydney's coastal people. We then concluded the first day with an esteemed panel of academic experts who explored the inquiries of John Thomas Bigg, who arrived in New South Wales in 1819 to report to Britain on every aspect of the colony. Professor Kirsten McKenzie from the University of Sydney explained that Bigg's inquiry was part of a huge stock-taking investigation undertaken by the British government across the empire to foster good governance and prevent the revolutionary upheaval it had seen in Gulf America, France and Haiti. Kirsten observed that while Bigg's commission into New South Wales proved to be transformative, it was designed to control change rather than unleash it. Associate Professor David Andrew Roberts from the University of New England then took us through the mechanics of the Bigg inquiry and the monumental body of evidence left in archives until relatively recently, owing to its political sensitivity. Dr. Matthew Allen, also from the University of New England, spoke to the role of public opinion and gossip, first in informing the decision to send Bigg to New South Wales, and then its influence on the views that Bigg formed while here. And finally, day one drew to a close with Professor Lisa Ford of UNSW underscoring an important point, that while the Bigg inquiry preceded the establishment of the council, a legislative council was not Bigg's idea. He had a different model in mind that would have seen laws verified by an Attorney General, a council comprised of the colony's magistrates, and laws passed by majority vote. David, would you like to explain what happened on day two?
Thanks, Jenelle. Day two of the conference was delayed for some weeks due to the death overnight between what was to be day one and two of Her late Majesty Queen Elizabeth II. So when the conference finally reconvened some weeks later, the first session was a somewhat eclectic set of papers exploring how politics was practiced by those possessing political power in the infant colony prior to the establishment of the Legislative Council, and on the other hand, the reality of life for those who were powerless. Kirsten McKenzie came back again. She talked about how politics was done by the powerful, largely through the press and the courts. She used scandal as her theme, thereby providing a reason to tell some rather racy stories. Penny Russell and James Dunk were more concerned with the reality of life for the powerless. Penny Russell's focus being on the extreme violence, including sexual violence experienced by women. James Dunk also explored a dark theme, the extraordinary rate of suicide in the infant colony. Like Penny Russell, he drew on impeccable primary sources, namely the reports of coronial inquiries, as well as contemporary press reports. He painted a bleak picture and explored whether what was occurring was a spreading contagion, the consequences of dissipation, or merely the consequences of a regime of increasing terror towards the convict population, particularly in the post-Macquarie era. We then went on to explore the topic of executive power, unrestrained and restrained. Reverend Dr. John Harris and Caleb Cugley took us on a more in-depth appraisal of the same Macquarie era and its direct aftermath. Reverend Harris provided an essentially sympathetic account of Macquarie, his achievements and motivations, including a motivation based on benevolence and a commitment to the reformation and restoration of convicts, the so-called emancipists. Nevertheless, he did not shy away from recognising the eventual, perhaps reluctant, but ultimately tragic and brutal response of Macquarie to frontier conflict with Aboriginal people. Caleb then explored the extent to which it could genuinely be said that the establishment of the Legislative Council was or was not designed to be a restraint on the sort of executive power exercised by Macquarie.
Next followed Westpac Group archivist and historian Kim Epperhard, who spoke to the role of Governor Lachlan Macquarie as architect of the now famous holy dollars and dumps, bringing Australia's very first currency to the colony. Kim also discussed how disputes that occurred over the multitude of different currencies circulating in the colony prompted the governor to proclaim sterling as the chosen medium of monetary exchange, and this later led to the establishment of the Bank of New South Wales. This brought us to one of my favourite sessions with author Jessica North, who opened our eyes to the volume of unwritten histories that are yet to be told from the early years of New South Wales. Tales of women of influence, clever women, resilient women, and bold women. But as Jessica pointed out, most people have never heard of them. Jessica shared the stories of Esther Abrahams, a convict single mother who became the first woman to manage a large agricultural estate. Note that it wasn't Elizabeth MacArthur. Susanna Cable, the subject of the first civil law case in Australia, Sarah Wills, the instigator of the first prenuptial agreement, and Mary Ann Piper, the child of convicts who became a society queen, promoting Australia around the world. Speakers like Jessica, Ray, Paul and Danielle underscored how important it is that the perspectives of women, Aboriginal people and other groups previously silenced in history are now being shared.
The first conference concluded with a keynote address from Ita Buttrose, reflecting on her own personal connection with Fawcluse House and thereby with the legacy of W.C. Wentworth. She enthralled the audience with the story of Wentworth's clashes as both a newspaper owner and a barrister with Governor Darling. Ms. Buttrose's presentation was both insightful and inspiring in its clarion call for the importance of both a free press and an evolving parliamentary democracy. The second conference, this time held over 2 consecutive days in late 2023, was focused on the legislative instrument that facilitated the creation of both the Legislative Council and the Supreme Court, namely the New South Wales Act of 1823, an act of the British Parliament. In some ways, however, the conference began by filling a gap in the earlier conference which had explored the context. Stephen Garton addressed the myriad important linkages between New South Wales and other parts of the British Empire, with a particular emphasis on trade, links with Calcutta, and experimentation with various models of colonial governance across the empire. These models both influenced and were in turn influenced by the establishment and later evolution of the New South Wales Legislative Council and later the Assembly. The second paper was delivered by Frank Bongiorno. Now, I'm a little bit nervous summarising Frank's presentation, given he's here in the audience and is about to take the stage and will have a right of reply. Suffice to say, Frank's extremely erudite paper argued that the Legislative Council caused few ripples and initially was largely peripheral to the real business of politics in the colony, which instead played out in grand banquets, public meetings, the courts and the press, petitions and correspondence sent back to London. Frank situated the rationale for the establishment of the council not in any ideas of representative democracy or even restraint on executive power, but rather as a response to anxiety about the lawfulness of the existing order in the colony. It was not to be until the 1830s and 1840s that the council would become a place of deliberation and political importance. I hope I've done you justice, Frank. Very good.
Then followed a session with esteemed barrister Brett Walker, SC, and former Clerk of the Parliament's Lynn Lovelock. Lynn painted a picture of the passage of the bill through Parliament, debated across several days and in the early hours of the morning, and polarising opinion in the House to the extent that it reflected the prevailing and sometimes disparate attitudes of members towards law, order and punishment. We learned that following a rollercoaster journey, the Act was finally passed as a compromise in the early hours of the session on the same day the Parliament was prorogued. Brett Walker then explored the significance of the 1823 Act. Well, I say significance, but Brett actually provided a rather damning indictment of the Act, pointing first to the provisions relating to the council, which he described as entirely non-representative and anti-democratic, given the council was merely a check on the governor and the members were appointees who held other positions in the colony and were all men. And then to those establishing the Supreme Court, which omitted the rather key principle of trial by jury, amongst other things. Brett concluded, and I quote, "There was no conflagration started by anything that constituted the spark in 1823. One is reminded that in the days before safety matches, you did have to generate a spark which would actually catch fire. Many a spark would not produce anything." Which I have to confess rather challenged the whole concept we come up with for the conference. Of course, Brett's point, thankfully made at the end, was that the council established in 1823 bears no resemblance to the demonstrably representative, robust and democratic institution that we enjoy today. So it was a fair point made indeed. David Andrew Roberts from UNE then returned for our second year and provided some of the broader global and political context that underscored Lynn and Brett's observations. He noted that the form of the council agreed to was actually a cautious compromise in the age of revolution. With lawmakers in the UK having learned from the upheaval taking place elsewhere in the world, the council was designed to temper both the potential for tyrannical executive power and guard against the dangers of representative democracy. In the end, it appeased few. And this is what quickly prompted the evolution of the council, which we'll hear more about today.
Once again, I'm a little nervous as Keith Mason is here in the audience and will be also taking the stage shortly. However, one of the real delights of our second conference was that it was essentially a co-production between the Legislative Council and the Supreme Court, both institutions having been established in 1824 as a consequence of that 1823 Act of the British Parliament. So we went over to the court in the afternoon, and over in the Banco Court, surrounded by the portraits of the Chief Justices since Frederick Forbes, the Chief Justice, together with Keith Mason and Virginia Bell, entertained and informed us all. Keith Mason focused on Francis Forbes, the instigator of the Legislative Council and the first Chief Justice of New South Wales. Chief Justice Andrew Bell introduced each of the Chief Justices of the Supreme Court, and Virginia Bell focused on the role of women in the court. In some ways, the Supreme Court effectively did last year what we are seeking to do this morning, that is, cover 200 years of history in a riveting and insightful way over just over an hour and a quarter. No pressure, Frank and Rodney. Of course, the Legislative Council and the Supreme Court were not the only great institutions of government established in 1824. So too were the Colonial Treasury and the Auditor-General. Treasurer Daniel Mookie set the scene for the establishment of the Treasury, including the appointment of William Balcombe as Treasurer, fresh from his role as jailer on St Helena of Napoleon. The current Treasurer also highlighted a number of connections, not only via William Balcombe and St Helena, with the Atlantic slave trade and the East India Company. It was indeed a small and connected world. Carol Liston went on to elaborate on the role of money and currency in the colony, along with some of the individuals who were instrumental in the regulation of the infant economy and its financial institutions. Now, the New South Wales Treasury have since published a delightful history, a collection of essays entitled Walking a Tightrope, Milestones and Moments in the History of the New South Wales Treasury, edited by historian Paul Ashton. I do commend it, including the essay on the Lang Plan, 1931, by Frank.
Following on from the establishment of the early Treasury, we learn that where you have a Treasury, you must also have an auditor. The esteemed Margaret Crawford, then Auditor-General of New South Wales, described the early origins of the Audit Office and how legislative changes have enabled this integrity body to help Parliament hold government accountable. Margaret called on all of us to be fierce in our defence of our system of government and to talk loud and often about Parliament and the public institutions that support integrity, transparency and accountability. Shifting from the official face of all those institutions to the personal, we also enjoyed a fantastic session with author, journalist and historian Sue Williams, who brought to life the trials and tribulations of the first 5 members of the council. Sharing some of the personal stories that shaped those men, Sue described them as schemers and dreamers, navigating broken hearts, split loyalties and the pressure of expectation. Sue observed that while there is no doubt those first members were extremely privileged, their lives were inherently difficult, with each man trying to balance their personal and professional lives and one often suffering at the expense of the other. Interestingly, Sue demonstrated that those who had wives were often much better off than those who did not, because the women were selflessly supportive of their husbands.
That brings us to the end of our recap of those first 2 conferences. We hope that they have left a legacy of some new insights into early colonial history and the establishment of the Legislative Council. If you haven't already done so, take the opportunity to pick up a copy of the conference proceedings, which have been published as a permanent record.